Welcome to History Now. In today's show we're going to revisit some of the themes that we talked about in the very first episode to do with the North and the Civil War. It's my very great pleasure to welcome two great historians here today, Cathal Brennan from IrishHistoryShow.ie and John Dorney, an author and historian from The Irish Story. You're both very welcome. Okay, John, if we can go to you first. Could you give us a sense of probably the sort of leading pro-treaty figures and their attitudes towards the North at the time of the treaty?
There's a lot of contradictory attitudes, or what we might think of as contradictory. And by that I mean people like Michael Collins, who obviously signs the treaty, is the leading pro-treaty figure, is extremely hard on partition, both in public and in private. So he says things like, the treaty is the thing that will do away with partition in the long run. In private, he's telling the Northern IRA, particularly the Belfast IRA, that he, in his new government in Dublin, is the person who can get the money and arms, and we can finish partition in that way. Other people who, again, history would associate with the pro-treaty side and so on, people like Owen O'Duffy, are again extremely hard on partition. Like Owen O'Duffy is sent to the North during the truce period, theoretically to monitor the truce, but actually to take command of the IRA in Belfast. And he gives speeches saying, for example, give them the lead to the Unionists, and he mobilises the IRA basically in pitched battles with the police and with loyalists. In terms of pro-treaty figures within the Northern IRA, with the exception of Joe McKelvey, who had been the long-time head of the Belfast Brigade, almost all the Belfast Brigade, for example, is pro-treaty. From Roger McCorley, who had been the head of the ASU in Belfast on down, you have probably at least 70% pro-treaty. Going back to Collins does a lot of kind of shuffling in early 1922 in a bid to avoid a civil war in the South. And one of the things that he tries is to assure people that if they unite around the issue of partition, he can reunite the IRA, and he can also bring down Northern Ireland, the infant Northern Ireland. He sends pro-treaty units to the border. He sends arms over the border. He also has a deal to not alone allow anti-treaty units to enter the border area, but also to arm them. And even after the Civil War starts, one thing that I found when I was researching my book on the Civil War in Dublin was Collins' rhetoric is still extremely hard on the North, even within the cabinet. He says, this war is only training for our troops, for the Free State Army. He says the real war will be with our real enemies in the Northeast. So, even though Collins is associated with compromise in the treaty, the truth is that he's extremely anti-partition.
And Cathal, have you any examples from your research on that?
Well, it's interesting because, say, in the west of Ulster, you have somebody like Cara Healy, and he would have been somebody who would have been involved with Sinn Féin from 1905. So we tend to think of the six counties as a very heavily Nationalist Party, Irish Parliamentary Party area. But you can see as it sort of collapses Irish Parliamentary Party support in the south and west of the country, it hangs on a bit longer in the north because obviously it's not as moribund. You have fierce elections there being contested there. But also from the time of the Home Rule crisis and sort of the Ulster Covenant in 1912, the whole issue of partition, and not just will a part of the northeast be partitioned away from a home rule parliament in Dublin, but how much of Ulster? And you're going from this period where people are talking about, will it be a nine county Ulster, will it be a 4-county, the 4 Protestant majority counties, or 6 counties? And this obviously plays in as well to the treaty too, with the whole Article 12 issue. So people like Healy and nationalists in the west of what would become Northern Ireland, the border counties, are placing a lot of faith on their areas not being part of Northern Ireland or being excluded from what had been agreed on in the 1920 Government of Ireland Act.
Yeah, and what about like the likes of Eamon de Valera and people who were anti-treaty who would go on to, for decades afterwards, go on about partition and things like that, the anti-partition leagues in the 1940s? What was their viewpoint on it?
If you were being cynical, and you should be, you could say de Valera started going on about it in 1922. Partition is the greatest crime against the Irish nation and so on like this. One of the funny things about early 1922 in hindsight is that, Collins kind of steals the issue from him. It becomes Collins' issue rather than de Valera's issue. But as a lot of historians will tell you today, de Valera is not the leading man in terms of the military side of the anti-treaty movement. You're looking much more at people like Liam Lynch and even more radical people like, Rory O'Connor. And their line is extremely like anti-partition. There's no question, that they're in some way only concerned about the South, which you sometimes see suggested today. So Lynch, for example, cooperates very closely with Michael Collins in the spring of 1922 for this hoped for joint Northern offensive against Northern Ireland. Now, this is a complicated period and there's lots of ins and outs, but there's so many different factions within the movement because it splinters. The treaty splinters the movement. There isn't just two factions. So there's Liam Lynch, who was elected the head of the AntiTreaty IRA, who reject the treaty and reject the Dáil in the South and reject the Free State. But there's also the group in the Four Courts, who occupied the Four Courts, the centre of the legal system in Dublin. And they decide they're not going to take orders from Liam Lynch. They're an even more radical group. Rory O'Connor, Joe McKelvey of Belfast is also there. Ernie O'Malley is also a leading light there, and Tom Barry is there for quite a long time. And they actually made a decision just before the start of the Civil War that they were going to declare war on the British. In fact, they delivered an ultimatum to the British saying they were declaring war. And they apparently had units ready to go to the north. And this wasn't just empty rhetoric because they were seizing transport. They were essentially stealing cars all over Dublin and trucks and loading them up with weapons and explosives. And these were all parked in the courtyard of the Four Courts when the Civil War broke out. So the relationship of what ends up being a civil war in the South over the treaty and the North is often kind of confused because what you see in terms of the people who were militant Republicans on both sides are both extremely anti-partition, both in public and in private, like I said. Now, there's people in the South, certainly, who don't care so much about partition and are more concerned about the South. But in terms of the Republican movement that split, both sides are extremely anti-partition, and there's not really much to choose from them. Like I mentioned Owen O'Duffy before, who was a hardcore pro-treaty figure, but is very anti-unionist. Sean McKeown would be another example. He'd be an IRA leader in County Longford. And, Sean McKeown makes speeches up in County Longford saying, we want to welcome the former unionists, into the Irish nation now that we have the Free State. But he says if the unionists, if they're not prepared to be good Irishmen, we will treat them as such. They will be our enemies. And this is a pro-treaty figure, and you get that kind of rhetoric on both sides of the treaty split, to be honest. I would say there isn't actually that much to choose between them in 1922-23. Now, later on it changes. Yeah.
Let's move it on to the border itself. When the Government of Ireland Act comes into effect, I know you've looked at tensions around the borders. Could you give us some example of that, if we can go to Cathal first?
Among politicians, we take into account as well that there was municipal and local rural elections happened in January and June of 1920. So a lot of these areas along the border counties, like Tyrone and Fermanagh County Councils, would have went nationalist or would have been nationalist controlled. And also you have, for the first time since the Willie Moy period, Derry City elects a nationalist corporation. And this obviously becomes a big issue in terms of the new Northern Ireland, because the justification for the new Northern Ireland being 6 counties is that this is a fairly homogenous unionist area. And if you can't coerce unionists in the northeast into being part of an All-Ireland Dublin-run government, by the same rationale, you can't really expect people, nationalists, Ulster nationalists, to want to be part of a new Stormont 6-county administration. So that becomes a big issue in places like Derry, Tyrone, Fermanagh. But also when you're looking at Article 12 within the treaty, that's talking about a boundary commission. So what's that going to exclude as well? You're talking about places like South Down, South Armagh, and the results of these elections in terms of urban councils, corporations, county councils, and also rural councils. So the issue is that both sides are looking at it from a very different way. It's the same article, but from the nationalist perspective, from the Northern Nationalists, and also from the Dublin government and from the likes of Collins and Griffith who are selling the treaty, this Article 12 is going to take all the areas that have a nationalist majority and transfer them to the south. But when you look at the wording of it, they're talking about economic considerations and, for example, unionists in Derry and also the unionist government in Belfast would say this is our second biggest city, we can't afford to let it go. And also a place like South Down, you're talking about the water supply coming into Belfast. So people have very heightened expectations, especially in Fermanagh and Tyrone and places like that around the treaty, that this is their exit out of the new Northern Ireland state.
We've heard the political, but in terms of military, activity around the border, should we say? There was a lot of sort of, facing off against one another.
Absolutely. One thing that struck me was, a bit like Cathal was saying, people are surprised when the border comes about, because the border kind of, people don't take it seriously at first. The treaty is sold as, the border will be a temporary thing, that the nationalist areas will basically be able to secede. And people don't take it seriously at first. In late 1921, like the local papers, the Anglo-Celt and Cavan Monaghan paper, is saying, this is never going to be a border. This Northern Ireland thing is not going to fly. They're going to be bankrupt and so on. And in early 1922, the border arrives. So it mainly arrives in the form of the Special Constabulary, the Ulster Special Constabulary, later on known as the B Specials, but at the time there was 3 classes, A, B and C. They block roads, they dig ditches, and they create a physical border. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. What happens is there's a series of violent events that kick off basically a low-intensity war. So there's a party of IRA men, senior IRA officers from the 5th Northern Division, who were arrested in Derry. Supposedly they're a Monaghan Gaelic football team, but really they're there to gather intelligence. They're trying to do a prison break. They're arrested by the Northern government. Collins, and in particular Dan Hogan, who was the IRA commander in Monaghan, take a load of border unionists hostage from South County Fermanagh. Violence breaks out in Belfast, as it did kind of regularly. And there's also an incident where a trainload of specials was ambushed in Clonus in County Monaghan when they were changing trains, and 12 or 13 of them are shot and 4 of them are killed. Now, in response to that, as I said, the specials, of whom there was about 20,000 well-armed, essentially militiamen really, rather than policemen, they physically erect a border. And all of a sudden in February, March 1922, the local papers start talking about there's firing every night across the border. Nobody can get back and forwards to their farms. There's assassinations, there's killings on both sides, to be fair. But I mean, the southern papers would constantly say, well, in contrast to the treatment of Catholics north of the border, no harm comes to Unionists south of the border because we're far too broad-minded for that. That's not the truth. There's orange halls burned down, there's schools burned down on the southern side of the border too. There are some killings, and not so much of like random Protestants, but there are some killings of people they perceive as Unionists. And there are some people also exiled from the Free State into Northern Ireland because possibly they were specials, or possibly they were members of some other armed group. But in the border areas, also you see on both sides threatening notices posted. Like, for example, there's notices posted in Clonus, County Monaghan, saying for every Catholic murdered in Belfast, there will be an Irishman murdered in Monaghan. But there's the same thing on the northern side, where the specials have control. So in the early months of 1922, you basically have a low-intensity war along the new border.
So it's like a civil war, pre-civil war?
It's the other civil war. And, it's had things been different, we could talk about that as the civil war, Yeah.
When we think about like minorities and the nationalists after Northern Ireland, there was also tens of thousands of unionists in Ulster, but not in Northern Ireland. Like the Ulster Unionist Council is a 9-county body, the UVF is a 9-county body, and a lot of unionists, particularly in places like North Monaghan and East Donegal, are now left on the wrong side of the border. All this time they were expecting that they would be excluded from Home Rule, not necessarily 2 Home Rule parliaments, but like the 9 counties of Ulster would continue to be ruled by from Westminster.
The rhetoric of border unionists who end up on the southern side, they were extremely disappointed in the treaty. They say it's the Treaty of Surrender, much as the AntiTreaty Republicans did. But they had and they felt betrayed by their brethren in the north. I mean, they really expected that they'd be looked after, and now they find themselves on the wrong side of this border. Although it's funny to see their rhetoric change, as the years go by. So in 1921, at the time of the truce, unionists in Cavan Monaghan are saying things like, well, the loyalists, if they were properly armed, could have licked the IRA in a few minutes. And they're saying, there can never be peace with the murderers of Dean Finlay, who was a cleric who was killed in County Cavan. And in 1922, after the treaty, and they're not saying that anymore. They're saying things like, we're prepared to be good citizens of the Free State. We're better citizens than these gunmen, the AntiTreaty IRA. Their rhetoric quite quickly changes to accommodation when they realise the way the wind is blowing.
So we've already spoken about how arms were transferred across the border, but when there's a lot of violence, a lot of upheaval, people crossing the border in terms of refugees. Now I know Brian Hanley's been doing some research on later refugees across the border, but a lot of it happened, and You see, from my reading of it, you see a lot of similar stories. Can you perhaps tell us about some of the stories about refugees coming to the south from the north?
It's striking how similar it is, because I read Brian Hanley's book quite recently on the 1969 and 1970 refugees. So what happens is it's an extremely violent period in Belfast in particular, and it's known among nationalists as the pogrom, because the perception is that Catholic civilians are getting killed, both by loyalists and by the police in large numbers. People have pointed out it's not quite so one-sided as that, but certainly Catholics are A, the majority of victims, and B, disproportionately so. You have events like the McMahon murders, where a family of 5 is basically wiped out up in North Belfast. And this prompts a rush of Catholic refugees across the border, mostly from Belfast. There's, according to the press at the time, between 20 and 30,000 in the south. The Dublin government says it's housing about 1,500 in Dublin. That's an official figure, so possibly it's not as many as 20 or 30,000, but it's certainly very large. There's large concentrations in places like Dundalk, Carrickmacross, places like that. And they helped to destabilise Southern politics in the lead up to Civil War. The reason being that, okay, both sides are against partition, but one side, the pro-treaty side, is trying to set up a government and the rule of law. The anti-treaty side are prepared to break the law. And that alone in itself makes a confrontation, because they do things like they seize in Dublin, they seize the Orange Hall, which is on Parnell Square, Fowler Hall. They seize the Masonic Lodge on Molesworth Street, the Kildare Street Club, which was like high Tory unionism, and they house the Belfast refugees there. So they're doing two things. They're looking after refugees from Belfast, yes, but they're also making a statement. They're seizing unionist property. And the provisional government, the pro-treaty government, can't allow this. Even if it's in sympathy with the refugees, these people are breaking the law. And so this is one of the things that actually heightens tensions and eventually leads to civil war in the south. Because as well as housing refugees, one thing anti-treatyites are constantly doing in the first 6 months of 1922 is enforcing the Belfast boycott, which is a ban on doing business with Belfast as long as the pogrom continued. And in the end, it was Leo Henderson, who was the leader of the Belfast boycott in Dublin, seizing cars on Baggot Street in central Dublin and getting arrested by Free State troops that actually sparked the Civil War. But another parallel, though, we mentioned 1969 and so on, another parallel is Brian Hanley says in his book that there was quite a lot of prejudice directed against the refugees of that era, and the same was true in 1922. So even among the IRA men who were housing them in central Dublin, in Fowler's Hall on O'Connell Street, in the YMCA building on O'Connell Street in Dublin, the reminiscences of the anti-treaty IRA men are quite hostile actually to the refugees. They say they weren't grateful for our help, they wanted too much, they never said thank you. One says they were stealing from the shops on O'Connell Street, and he had to come down with the Thompson gun, so a submachine gun, to threaten them and put them back in their place. And the other thing the anti-treaty I'd say is, and we might get onto this again, is that because so many of their menfolk actually ended up on the pro-treaty side of the split, that their womenfolk and children bit the hand that feed them. So they put all this effort into housing them and helping them in Dublin and elsewhere. And they felt betrayed because, so many of the Northerners were pro-treaty in the Civil War.
Looking at how disillusioned Northern nationalists become with Dublin and Dublin governments post the Boundary Commission in 1925, because not only that, where the Dublin government sort of agreed to leave the border where it is and not contest it, during this period, during the earlier period, Northern nationalists are getting a lot of encouragement. So, say for like national school teachers, for example, their salaries continue to be paid by Dublin, and they're told not to recognise the state. And other county councils, local councils are told continue to recognise Dáil Éireann before they're eventually abolished by Stormont. But other things, like just interesting looking at individual cases, like in Camlock, for example, where a lot of houses have been destroyed in reprisals after an attack on the RIC. They were told that they'd all be, reimbursed by Dublin. And when Frank Aiken, who was then had joined Fianna Fáil, and he's from Camlock as well, and he's making inquiries on their behalf, they're basically told by Cumann na Gael, direct your inquiries to the Northern government, who obviously are not going to be very receptive to paying compensation. But you do notice that just the disillusionment, and as well that, as John had said as well, a lot of Northern nationalists, like a majority of them, are supportive of the treaty. They keep faith with Dublin, and they don't get much in return, really.
Yeah. Is there any sense, you talked about evictions from the south to the north. Was there any sort of any size of refugees coming from south to north?
I mean, I haven't researched this, but anecdotally there is some, yeah. After the treaty is signed, but before the Civil War, is an extremely anarchic time south of the border, because you've got two rival armies, or three, because the British Army is still there in Dublin. You've got no police force, really. So there's a lot of stuff like land agitation. There's this wave of armed crime. And in response to the events in the north, the events in the north, what's known as the pogrom, is extensively covered in the press in the south. And across the board opinion is that, the nationalists are the victims. And it has been exaggerated at times, but there is kind of a backlash against Southern Protestants in places. Like, for example, in Cork, the IRA are raiding for cars, which is, very common in early 1922. An IRA commander, Michael O'Neill, is shot dead by a local loyalist. And it looks very much like the local IRA, shoot 13 local loyalists who are all Protestants. And there is a mini exodus from West Cork in response to that, whether some of them end up in England, some of them end up in the north. Anecdotally, there does seem to be a lot of families with stories of how their origins were in the south, but at that time they went across the border. I can't put numbers on it, but yes, it does happen though.
Yeah. Just going back to what you said about refugees, what was the sense of the general population in relation to refugees?
The atmosphere, as I said, in early 1922 in the south was sympathetic to Northern nationalists. You probably didn't have a big enough exodus, to warrant people kind of changing their minds. But certainly, I mean, the sympathy kind of cools quite quickly once the Civil War breaks out in the south and people are worried about other things. And I mean, you find all kinds of contradictory things, like kind of in line with what Cathal mentioned. Although most Northern IRA men, like 800 to 900 Northern IRA men flee the north after internment is imposed in May 22, end up in the Curragh. Most of them join the Free State Army. You do tend to find Northern refugees suspected, particularly in border counties, of having anti-treaty sympathies. So, Northern refugees, especially once the Civil War breaks out, are like, history's forgotten children. Nobody really wants them anymore. And one of the things you see as well is Ernest Blythe, who is a Protestant from County Down, but is a lifelong nationalist. And he's a member of the provisional government, the Free State government. And he's the one man in the cabinet who brings up the Northern refugees once the Civil War starts. I mean, there's plenty of talk about them before. But once the Civil War starts, in about November 1922, so deep into the Civil War, Ernest Blythe asks, is there any money available for the Belfast refugees in Dublin? And the cabinet says, no. Not only that, but there won't be any money for them, So paradoxically, although, the Northerners aren't responsible for the Southern Civil War, they are possibly the biggest losers from it.
Yeah.
What's interesting as well, as John was saying, that the popular historiography is that Northern Ireland has nothing to do with splits over the treaty or the Civil War or anything like this, but it keeps popping up time and time again. It keeps becoming a factor in how things develop.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of people attached to the IRA from the north who end up in the south and end up in the Free State Army, what role did they have in the time?
They're surprisingly prominent in the National Army or the Free State Army during the Civil War. Like, for example, I mentioned 800 to 900 are in the Curragh, and supposedly they're going to be sent back to the north. Of course, that never happens, because of the Civil War breaks out. They're eventually drafted into the National Army. And for example, like the Free State Army mounts a series of seaborne landings in Cork and Kerry. And in the landing in Cork, for example, there's 3 men from Belfast killed, fighting on the Free State side. Roger McCorley, who I mentioned before, is a very militant IRA member from Belfast, the head of the ASU, in fact, is sent first to Dublin, where he's heavily involved in fighting there, then to Kerry, where he develops quite an unsavoury reputation as, for treatment of prisoners, and finally back to Dublin, where he's involved in stuff like breaking up prison riots in Mountjoy of anti-treaty prisoners. One thing, though, I did find which was curious was in Dublin, the government drafted more Northern troops in to Dublin, to garrison Dublin as the Civil War went on. So major combat operations in Dublin were mainly the first week, but there was kind of a low-level, vicious guerrilla war there. And what you found is that Northern men were kinder, if you like, to anti-treaty prisoners, less likely to commit abuses, less likely to commit killings of prisoners than Dublin Free State soldiers. Like a number of anti-treaty prisoners say this in their reminiscences that, thank God we were taken by Northern men, because at least, they weren't going to kill us. Which is funny, but, there is certainly over 1,000 Northern Republicans who were served throughout the Civil War on the Free State side.
Okay, yeah, so just to wrap up, there's obviously with the tensions around the border, with people coming across, with arms going one way, there seems to be, what you've said, a retreat from radicalism from the Free State government. Can you tell us why that is? Is that to do partly with the Civil War, is partly to do with like trying to bed in some sort of normality?
Yeah, initially it's a response to the Civil War. So once the Civil War breaks out, every other consideration for the Dublin government goes out the window. They're only concerned with the survival of the government and of the treaty. And the North is one of the first things that's jettisoned, you know. So, like, whereas Michael Collins had, as I mentioned, been extremely hard on the North, Collins is obviously killed into the Civil War, and his successors are much less hard. And they once Collins is dead, the rhetoric about ending partition militarily is gone completely. There's an order given to National Army units in, I think, September 22, that they're not to enter the North under any circumstance, which is new because, you know, they prior to the Civil War, they'd been kind of basically fighting a war with the specials on the border. There's also kind of low-level cases, you might say, where the northern and southern states suddenly realise they have something in common, which is they have the same enemy in the anti-treaty IRA. And you see things like relations improve between the army first and then the Civic Guard, or the Gardaí they're called now, get set up halfway through the Civil War. Relations improved between them and the RUC and the specials after the Civil War because suddenly they have a common enemy. And you even see things like, I know of one case where a soldier from County Fermanagh, a Free State soldier, was killed down in Cork or Kerry, and he's brought back for a funeral, I think to Balik, if I remember correctly. And, you know, the specials actually, they take the coffin across the border from the Free State soldiers, but they salute as it's going past, you know. So purely down to necessity, the Free State government forgets about partition altogether once the Civil War breaks out. Now, after the Civil War proper, and in the period of the 20s, you do see a change. So I mentioned that there's nothing to choose between the sides and partition in 22. That changes. You know, the people in Cumann and Nail in the pro-treaty establishment start to think of the Free State as their country. You know, they start to lose that perspective of 32 County Ireland. And that is a big change. It's a significant change.
I think as well, like, you know, you take into account the economic factors, how expensive it is to run a civil war, and this enormous army by the state standards, having to demobilise them, and it could become like a running sore, particularly the type of Collins rhetoric that we're just waiting for the opportunity to launch a military attack on the North. That all goes out the window, and sort of like the agreement that you have after the Boundary Commission, that was sort of like, this is the final deal. Now we've secured some, like, you know, rebates in terms of tax and things that we owe, but we're not going to pursue the issue of the border or the issue of partition any further. And I think even when you see when Fianna Fáil come in, you do see them legalising things like the IRA, but that only lasts for so long. Like, you can't have that disruptive factor there in the background while you can't ride two horses really of trying to be the government of a state and paying lip service at the same time, or maybe even quasi-support to a group that might involve you in a very destabilising war with your neighbour.
Okay. So I'd just like to thank my guests today, Cathal, Brennan and John Dorney. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary.